Emina 36, na legislature in Guam is back in session. We resume with the second reading file. We are on bill number 281-36 COR. Senator San Augustine, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move to resolve into the Committee of the Whole for the purpose of deliberating Bill number 281-36 as amended by the Committee on General Government Operation, Appropriation, and Housing, and that I chair the Committee of the Whole and invite the following panel members. They are Steve Guerrero, the Office of Finance and Budget, Mr. Lester Carlson, Director of Bureau of Budget Management Research, Mr. Ed Byrne, Director of Department Administration, Ms. Marie Panglinan, Executive Director of Guam Legislature Commission.
On that motion, are there any objections? If so, please raise your hand. Any objections? Seeing no objection, motion carries. We are now recessed and we will resume in Committee of the Whole, chaired by Senator San Augustine.
We are back from recess. The Committee of the Whole is now called to order. Materials for the Committee of the Whole are in the shared session Google Drive labeled 5.31.22 Committee of the Whole. Proposed amendments must be submitted in writing to the clerk via email 36glsession@gmail.com. Amendments not in writing will be called out of order. Colleagues, the rules of engagement. 3 rounds for discussions. We will have 2 rounds of questions for the panel, with each senator allotted 5 minutes for questions, not including responses. Time to speak may not be yielded from more than one member to another. A member who yields that member's time on a question yields all that member's time on that question and may not later speak, even if all the time yielded was not used, in accordance with our rules, section 1.02, delta 3. After the completion of the 2 rounds of questions, panelists will be excused. The 3rd round is for amendments or comments to speak on the bill or to the bill. After we complete the discussion of the bill, I will allow the sponsor to close, and I will entertain a motion for the recommendation of the Committee of the Whole, followed by a motion to rise from the Committee of the Whole, at which time I will report out the bill as recommended by the Committee of the Whole. Thank you. We'd now like to recognize Senator Joe San Augustine on Bill number 281-36 COR, as amended by the Committee on General Government Operations, Appropriations, and Housing. Just one moment, Senator. I will call on the Sergeant of Arms to swear our panel in and for their introduction. Sergeant of Arms.
If you can please stand and raise your right hand. Under penalty of perjury, do you all affirm that any and all information you provide today, whether it be verbally, electronically, and in writing, be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Madam Chair, you may proceed.
Thank you, Sergeant of Arms. Senator San Augustine, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, Bill 281-36 COR, as amended by the Committee on General Government Operations, Appropriation, and Housing, and introduced by myself, is an act to appropriate $609,000 from the general fund excess revenue collected above the adopted levels of fiscal year 2022 to the Guam Legislature Commission for the purpose of conducting the 2022 primary election and early in-office voting. In preparation for the last election, this legislature passed measures to ensure the safety of our people during the height of the pandemic and provided for an expanded early voting mechanism. Today, the Guam Legislature Commission is ensuring the law is followed by seeking funding to conduct early voting in the safest and most secured fashion. This bill will provide Guam Legislature Commission with the funding to ensure that venue is chosen and secure and that the election staff are properly trained to conduct the election. The funding source identifies the general fund excess revenue collected above the adopted levels of fiscal year 2022. We sought the assistance of the administration to ensure the availability of funds so we can be confident that the election rights of our people are kept intact. I humbly ask for the support of my colleagues on this measure. Jesus Marcy, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator San Augustine. Now I will invite members of the panel to please introduce yourself, starting from my left over to my right.
Thomas San Augustine, Guam Election Commission.
Maria Pangilinan, Guam Election Commission.
Steve Carroll, Office of Finance and Budget.
Lester Carlson, BBMR.
Edward Byrne, Department of Administration.
Colleagues, after that introduction, I will go down the line to see who would like to speak first. Senator Moylan, do you have any questions or comments at this time for the panel? This is our first round.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For Guam Election Commission, thank you for being here and also in support of the measure, of course. But if you can kindly, you gave some explanation during the public hearing, but I'm hoping you can also expand upon that regarding the early voting need for Guam and how has that worked for the Election Commission? What do they see the results of the early voting? And on that part, that's my first question, please.
So early voting for the 2022 primary election will start on July 28th. That's 30 days before the election. We will in 2020 general election early voting, we had over 12,000 early voters. We hope to get higher voter participation from both election day and early voting. So that's what we're looking for. We have finalized the award to Westin Hotel. That's where we will hold early voting in the mezzanine level. This primary and general election, we will have accessible voting. Accessible voting is when person with a disability cannot go up to the mezzanine level of the lobby. We have been meeting with Westin Hotel to make it as smooth as possible and as easy as possible for our voters. You know, something that I did not mention at the public hearing is that for the 2020 election, for both the general and the primary, we received $600,000 in federal funding. So that's what we used for our, you know, our preemptive measures to prevent the spread of COVID and to run the general election of 2020. If you remember, the 2020 primary election was canceled like 2 days before the primary. So we were in preparation mode up until 2 days before the election. So we were conducting early vote, in-office absentee voting during that time for the primary.
You provided some explanation of the breakdown on how this 609 will be used. Can you please express that one more time?
Senator, so for early voting, we have the venue. The venue will cost us about $15,000 a month. We will hire 20 personnel to operate early voting. We will also have to provide security. So we will have GPD. Our supplies run up to about $12,000 for early voting only. We have ballot stock that we have to buy, and we have to prepare. We have to prepare for 2 ballot sheets. So that's 150,000 ballots that we have to buy. We have, if you're asking only excuse me, about early voting, I think for now, that would be the main, for early voting itself, the main expenses.
Okay. You mentioned the place where the early voting would happen. How are you with this facility that has been selected as being the lowest bidder that has come on in? Is that for the Guam Election Commission? Do you think this is a location that is workable for you?
Yes, it is. So within the confines of the Guam procurement law, we initially did some market research. Then we did requested letters of interest to see who would be interested in bidding. From those letters of interest, we put together the specs. From those specs, we put together the invitation for bid. And 3 bidders came up, and so Westin was the lowest and the most responsive. We've been working with them. We've had meetings with our other partners, and so it seems like it's working, and we're doing what we can to make it so that it's conducive for the voters.
As this bill moves forward and the decision is made by the body, on your timelines, how is this working for you?
So from our invitation for bid, July 1 is when we sign. That's the date we sign with Westin Resort. We've been working with them already in the planning stages to put the contract together. Well, I cannot sign a contract if I can't certify. So hence the urgent need for the funds to be in place.
Thank you, Maria. And then for BBMR, well, it's okay. Yeah, he stepped up? Okay, second round, I'll talk to him. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Senator Moylan. Senator Torres, do you have any questions for the panel?
Yes, I just want to follow up, Mrs. Pangilinan. The amount requested under this bill is $609,000, and you stated at the public hearing that of that amount, 276 is dedicated to the center, which would be the Westin. Is that what we were saying for the 4 months?
Yeah, just for the venue, ma'am, is for 15,000 times 5.
Okay.
5 months.
So what was that $276,000? What was that? Is that
20 staff.
Oh, staff included?
Yes.
The 20 personnel that you would
Yes.
require, plus the
Yes.
rent and all of
Yes.
that? Okay, so then of that amount, it leaves about $330,000+ remaining of that 609,000. The question that I have is if you look at what was already budgeted to the Election Commission for elections, and I know that every year the Election Commission gets a budget, and every year they work towards an election, so they spend monies, whether there's an election conducted that year, there's money spent towards the next one, right? Either in...
Actually, Senator, every fiscal year funds an election.
Right.
So this is fiscal year 22, so it will fund a primary election. Fiscal year 23 will fund a general election. The balance of our supplemental request will go towards, right now, all the time, about this time, we're preparing for both the primary and the general. A good example would be how many ballot sheets do we order? So instead of ordering just for the primary, we order for the primary and the general. Also, the coding and programming, the bulk of the cost would be with the primary because it'll be about the same, but the programming and coding of the ballot, the cost, the one-time charge covers the general election as well.
Right, and that's understood, and I know that you've explained that well during the budget processes and all of that, and that's understood. But what I'm just trying to reconcile in my mind is why at this point are we looking at an additional amount of money over and above what was budgeted?
Suzus Masi. So what happened was we requested for 2.1 and we got 1.6, so the 300 is the short.
That plain and simple, that's what it is?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, it was 1.9 for fiscal year 23.
1.9.
So it was, the difference is what we requested and what was actually budgeted in the law.
And the last question that I have is, in this round is, if we were in a scenario where we were still at the original location in Agana, and we had that drive-through set up or the ability to go up to the offices, would that have saved a lot of money for the government in terms of the early voting or not?
No.
Is there a difference?
No, ma'am. If you notice from 2020 and prior election years, we were pretty lucky in getting additional space in the same building. So at this point, I've heard that the third floor, which we used in 2020, is occupied.
Okay. So you're pretty much in a scenario that you would have been in
Anyways.
regardless because there's speculation about the economies in terms of moving from one location to another. Did that, tie your hands in terms of your ability to conduct an election the way you have in the past? with the convenience and the access and all of that. So your answer pretty much is, in today's situation, had you been there, you probably would have been at the same place you are right now, requesting additional monies to allow for the conducting of a primary, given the facility restrictions and availability of use and all that, right? That's what you're saying?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. I just want to get an understanding about why we're requesting this much and how this situation, this election, differs from the last election. I think many of us are just trying to sort that out. Yeah, I don't have any, and one last question if I can. And to BBMR, the funds are available. Is that correct?
The funds that we have noted in the CRER as being excess over the adopted levels are available.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Nelson, do you have any questions for the panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the members of the Guam Election Committee, Mr. Byrne and Mr. Lester, for being here with us today. Just a question on the process of acquiring the venue. How did that go, and what was the time period for when you decided to have that venue as the primary location for the voting?
So we initiated the bid and put out a notice of intent to award on May 2nd. So on May 2nd, we said, and then after that, we had to wait 14 days to see if anybody will protest on the intention to award. So that would have been 12, maybe May 17th, we actually awarded the bid. Again, Senator, we initiated the procurement through, we did our own market research. Then we did requests for letters of interest, and then we initiated the bid.
Okay, thank you. And what year, May 2nd, 2022?
Hungan dispensa.
Okay, thank you. And what are the dates? It seems like you're going to have this for 5 days, this venue for 5 days in the discussion? I didn't
No,
catch
ma'am,
it.
5 months.
5 months.
So we want, what's important to us for voter participation is that if Tanana or Tunsay was going to the West End for the primary to vote early, it would be easier for them to remember that the early vote center is also at the West End.
And what is the date that the Guam Election Commission is looking to start the early in-office voting?
July 28th.
July 28th. Okay, thank you. Mr. Carlson, I saw on the committee that you see no issue with this general fund appropriation of $609,000. Is that still the case today?
That's correct, Senator.
Okay, so that means we underappropriated $609,000 on top of everything else that we've written bills for that have passed under the general fund for 2021, 2022?
Actually, the revenue collection has been extremely robust, exceeded the adopted level. Therefore, the resources are available.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Carlson. Thank you very much, Ms. Pangilinan, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Madam Speaker, do you have any questions for the panel?
Yes, thank you, and thank you to the panel for being here and answering all our questions. So first of all, when do you expect early voting for the general election?
Ma'am, October 10th.
October 10? Okay. So why are we renting it for September? You're going to go for 5 months straight. Why do you need to keep it for September?
So there's staging taking place already. And so instead of moving out and moving back in again, it saves a lot of man hours. And so we save more in man hours. We'd rather save more in man hours than the $15,000 rent.
What is the monthly rate?
About 14,500, 15,000.
And that's just for the venue?
Yes.
Are you keeping the employees? during
Yes.
that
Yes,
period
ma'am.
as well? Okay, and then the reason I'm asking is because I know when we do it in the schools, you guys come in just a few days ahead, not a months ahead, and you're able to set up and proceed.
Oh,
So
thank you for asking. So in early voting, the voter has to execute an affidavit. The voter has to seal his or her own ballot. It requires 2 envelopes. And so our employees, the 20 employees, have to learn how to execute the affidavit for the in-office absentee voting. It takes a little bit more than the precinct officials that do work on election day. On election day, the precinct officials have us as backup. We're at our offices answering all their calls. We do send out our employees, including the 20, to go to some of the polling sites where we think they'll need help if they're new. So,
Oh, okay.
Does
So
that-
the setup, though, you're able to set up in the schools in a matter of days versus here you're saying you need to set up for a matter of months.
we set up in July, Speaker.
No, I mean for the general.
Yeah, well, we set up in July, so it takes us a whole month to set up for early voting. So instead of taking that month again to set up for the general, where we're already busy preparing for the primary, it's all set up.
Okay. I was a little sad that this money is not going to one of the schools for use of their, but I heard your explanation and that we needed air cons, and most of the gyms, I guess, don't have air cons, but can you just repeat why we need air cons if we're not having we're not counting in these facilities, we're just voting, right?
Yes, but the ballots are there. The ballots that the early voters vote on are there. So we need to keep them nice and dry.
Okay. The amount that you want for the primary election is for 2022 or 2020 past?
2022.
Okay. And we're not able to get grants like you did in 2020?
None available. We do have $200,000 coming, but it's securities. So we plan on using that when we get it on some technology infrastructure.
All right. When you put out your specs, did you specify a village?
Yes, ma'am. We didn't specify a village, but we specified that it would be 5 drive miles from us.
From you?
from the Guam Election Commission office, because we will be transporting the official ballots from our office to wherever the early vote center is going to be.
Okay. I thought maybe we were going to make it convenient for the majority of the voters or something like that, Dedido Jigo. But it's in Tamuning, so it seems accessible to both Dedido and Tamuning and a lot of us. All right. And then what about... And then, so you said in your testimony that you asked for 20 parking spaces, right, at the West End, so that's what we're getting. And then, and that we're also going to have voting for persons with disabilities. That means they can stay in their car, and you're going to have a line coming in to the West End where they're going to vote in their cars?
Okay, Speaker. So as of May 2022, it's called accessible voting, which means please don't line up, unless you're taking your dad, in our car line for accessible voters. We don't want to hold up the Manamku who really cannot go up. So yes, we're going to have that. We're looking also into the possibility of having satellite parking close by, so we can shuttle voters into the West End.
Okay, but is that a yes? You're going to have the lines for the
Accessible voting.
Correct.
Yes.
All right, but is that different than the Manamco voting, are you saying? Yes? Well, that's okay, but
Yeah.
it's just going to be the same as you did before, right?
Actually, Speaker, I want to get away from saying it's going to be the same.
Okay.
Because last time we serviced a lot more curbside voters than we want to service this time.
Okay.
Thank you.
So you want to limit it to those who truly need it?
Yes.
And so we're going to say accessible voting persons
you
with
so much.
disabilities. All right. The, all right, yeah, I'm just curious to see how that's going to work. I've been to the Westin many, many times, even recently, and the parking spaces are tight. So I feel sorry for the Manamco who are parking there. They're tight, and everyone knows I'm challenged with those tight parkings. He's laughing, but I agree. The other thing is that, when you try to park, you got to go circles and circles and circles down, and then, find your way back up. And I remember only one elevator in the parking lot. Are there two in the parking lot or one? Because if there's only one, it's only on one end, or, that's all. I just hope we have enough places for people like Manamco and those with disabilities.
We're, the Westin's dedicating a whole floor for voters.
Great. Okay, good.
Also, Speaker, we are...
That's more than 20 then? Okay.
More than
Okay, great.
20. And then the other thing is we're also working with we found new partners in the hotel industry to work with us to make it so that it's accessible. We're looking into service from Department of Public Works and service from the Guam Visitors Bureau as well to work with us.
I know. So you talked about Public Works in your testimony as well at the public hearing. So I'm hoping they're going to help us with traffic jams in that area.
Speaker, one of the things that Westin taught us is that DPW, and I've already put in our request, could change the timing light at that light.
Okay. So
Change the intervals of the greens so that it's more on the Westin side.
all right. Thank you. So my final question for the fiscal team. This appropriation says it comes from the general fund to the Guam Election Commission. And if we pass it as is, we would be appropriating more money than we did estimate in revenues. So I know at the public hearing, I think, Mr. Carlson, BBMR, you had said that we should amend the language from FY22 general fund revenues to read from FY22 general fund revenues received over the adopted level. I agree with that language if that's what we're going to use. And so it's specifying we're not touching any of the appropriations. Otherwise, if we left it like this, is it fair to say that this then affects somebody else's appropriation?
Actually, Madam Speaker, the verbiage is in the bill as substituted.
Oh, I don't see the substitute. Sorry.
As amended.
Sorry, wait a minute.
Yeah, so we're good.
Sorry, there it is. Oh, so here you have it, excess revenues collected. All right. Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Senator Perez, do you have any questions for the panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to the panel. Yes, so Mr. Carlson, if you can just clarify, because in your initial fiscal note, it stated that it basically would exceed what is adopted in the general fund, that there should be an offset. So for the listening audience, can you explain if there's, how is it that there's enough money, considering that a lot of the appropriations bills after the budget was adopted, whether there's additional monies available?
Thank you, Senator. As written, going back to the speaker's point, if it was coming from the general fund, there would have to be an offset. But now that we've all massaged the language and identified revenues in excess, I believe we're on solid ground now. So there's no need to offset as initially contained in the fiscal note, because the language has been amended. So we feel comfortable.
Okay, so just looking at the most recent CRER tracking, I believe there was 35 million above what was predicted for the general fund, but it's, I believe the special funds are still not, they're underperforming. So can you provide more of a breakdown of how the additional funds would cover this?
Actually, ma'am, it's 87 million over adopted revenues for the general fund. And if Senator Duenas was here, you know, he likes to talk about the special funds and the disparity in where we were at the time. I think it was like February, March, where there was about a $10 million difference between what was adopted and what we projected to collect. That amount has also tightened up. It's about $4.6 million now. So the special funds are tracking better, not quite as good, nearly as good as the general fund. But the last CRER report basically says month over month, we've collected $87 million more than what was adopted.
Thank you. This question is for Stephen Guerrero. In regards to collections, would you say the over, I guess, the expectations of collections, can you identify where that's coming from, perhaps? Where is this increase in collections coming from? Is it a matter of, you know, around the time of taxes being filed? You know, of course, we see a bump in April, right, or whenever collections are due. Can we expect to see that continuation, the rise in collections? Or are we, what can you predict as far as, you know, revenue collections at this point?
Senator, if you look at least for the last 7 months of fiscal year 22, you know, like Director Bibi Mar said, we are actually collecting at a robust rate. I mean, we are totally, I personally am really surprised at the collection, especially in taxes, in all categories, income tax, withholding, and corporate. That to me is kind of surprising, but we are tracking at a level that right now I believe is almost 40 million above. 40 million above, not including the BBT, I believe is around 35 million above. So as of April 30th, total amount of the general fund in excess of what we anticipated to collect in FY22 is about 87 million. Going back to your question, do we expect it? I mean, I can look at the trend for the last 7 months. Just taking that because, you know, we can't go back and look at the last couple of years because, you know, there's just really no trend to use. But just at least in the collection of the last 7 months, I can safely say we are going to be collecting above at a robust rate by the end of the fiscal year.
Okay, thanks. This question is for Maria Pangilinan. So in regards to so you mentioned last 2020 election, basically there was an appropriation of 600,000 above what was budgeted. Is that correct?
It came from the U.S. Election Assistance Commission.
Okay, so it seems like it's a recurring amount. Would you say that's pretty accurate to say that that's what's needed for both the primary and the general election?
I think our fiscal year appropriation, our fiscal year budget request was 2.1.
Okay. All right. So
So Senator, it would be 2.1 plus, well, for fiscal year 2023, our request includes early voting, so it would be that 2.1.
I know in the public hearing you'd mentioned that you needed to seek another venue because the normal venues such as I think the field house was still being utilized. How late were they going to use it till? I mean, what is the overlap?
Senator, it's during the academic year, so they hold classes in the field house.
Okay, so it would be continually throughout the summer?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so yeah, I think if I guess I would encourage maybe next time to look for more of these public venues, working hand in hand, that could potentially lower the cost.
So we did, ma'am. So from the public hearing, I was encouraged to check into the old public health. So I called Director Arts in Augustin, and I also called Guam Community College Mary Okada, because I thought we were informed that maybe they're taking it over, but no way is it going to be ready by July 28th.
Okay. And then the other thing you mentioned that you're looking for satellite parking, would that incur an additional cost?
Possibly, but we don't know. I've called for an appointment with the owner of the site, so we don't know. For the 2020 election, we were able to get additional parking over in another area adjacent to GCIC. We were able to get staywell at no cost.
Okay. Okay, great. That's thank you for the responses, and that's my questions for now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Pierce. Senator Brown, do you have any questions for the panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly appreciate also the panel being here today. And we did vote for the legislation to allow additional days for early voting, but what has the trend been in the previous year? I know because of the pandemic, and certainly I do appreciate the efforts of your staff, Ms. Pangilinan, in facilitating that very well. A lot of people were hesitant to show up the day of the election to do the voting and came early. I was one of those also because it was a day to go out and campaign. But I wanted to ask you, and I'm curious to see, we'll probably have to go through this process, this election, to see the outcome, because of course it is additional cost. For some it may be more convenient, it may be not as convenient. I was at the Westin last week and was reminded, it's a beautiful hotel, but the parking structure leaves a lot to be desired for accessibility, and the elevators are not readily available. You have to walk to one end to access the elevators, otherwise you have to go up the middle stairway. So I guess we'll see what the outcome will be and whether or not, and as we discussed last time you were here, we continue to see the decreased trend of voters. I mean, Guam used to pride itself that, the day of the election, it was, everybody's out and voting, and that number and percentage, what now is the percentage of eligible voters do we have in the last election that actually turned up and participated to vote? Because I know it wasn't too long after you had a list of almost 8,000 plus, am I correct on or about that were eligible to vote that did not show up to vote, and we were a little concerned about that. I don't know, people just disappointed or just, don't really care about the elections anymore, or it doesn't matter who we put in office, we get the same old nonsense that goes on, or I'm sure that's a bigger study, but what was it last election? And compared to the gubernatorial election 2 years earlier, which also had the lowest turnout of any gubernatorial election in the history of the elected governors on Guam. I believe the current administration was elected at even the lowest amount. I believe even the election prior gubernatorial election when Governor Gutierrez ran, I don't know, but I think the numbers were fairly close of him losing. And that was the winning numbers for this current administration. So can you enlighten us about that?
I don't know if I can enlighten you about it, but something, Senator, the voter participation trend is decreasing. Since I've been there, unfortunately, I have to say that. And maybe it's because we've also poured lots of effort into registration outreach. So our registration numbers went up to 55,000 in, I believe, 2018, the last gubernatorial. And then for right now, we're only at 51,000.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it's still early. We have voter, it's the voter registration process is out there, and it's happening, but we don't know if we're going to reach 55,000 for the general. With regard to, let's look specifically at early voting. So in 2020, we had over 12,000 voters show up. And I believe the whole general election, they were 37,000 voters. So that's, a little close to, yeah,
And this was all early voting, the 37,000?
no, 12,000.
Oh, 12,000, oh, just 12,000,
Yeah.
okay, and then 37 was the total of voters that participated in the election. Okay.
Yeah, so close to half. It may have, Senator, it may have been 29,000, and 37,000 may have been 2018.
Okay.
So, but it is going down, and we're trying our hardest. The 8,000 number you pulled out was for those that did not vote in the 2020 and 2018 general elections. Those people were registered up until the 2020 general elections, but because they did not show up, we had to take them off. They did not show up for 2 consecutive general elections.
Can I just ask, for the time you've been with the Election Commission, that sounds like a relatively high number. Has there been any previous during the time you've been there where you've had to clear out the voter rolls because of non-participation?
Oh.
Has it come up to this number, or what have you seen before, prior?
Since I've been there, I think we're hovering at 6 to 8.
About 6 to 8?
Yes.
Wow, that's a high number. And with regards to, what is the final day for early voting, and then what's the final day to register to vote, just for our reference and the public, to remind them what the timelines are?
August 17th is the last day to register to vote.
Okay.
August 22nd is the last day to vote early.
And with the time frame, how much time in the last election did you give for early voting?
I believe,
During the pandemic? What was the length of time?
45 days.
Okay. And for this election, we're giving how many days for early voting?
Less than 30. We're supposed to start on the 30th day, but we close 5 days before the election.
And what would the average cost be for the election if we didn't have early voting? What on average would the primary election cost the Election Commission?
Oh, so it would be, mine is $276,000 to $300,000.
So early voting is increasing the cost about another 50% then, because
Yes.
you have to have the personnel manning on a daily
Yes.
basis. And I think we'll be hopeful. Let's see what the progress is this year, people turning out. I mean, we certainly want to encourage our community to vote, but we also want to make it, fiscally responsible in terms of what it's costing, because how much is it costing per vote, literally, that's being paid to sustain the early voting? Previously, you had to be off island or have a medical reason that you could not vote. And certainly, again, we want to encourage our people, but we want to be fiscally responsible, because I'm sure there are many areas of the government also. Another $300,000 would be useful. But thank you very much for responding to my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator, do you have any questions for the panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just would like to thank the panel for being here today. And for GEC, Ms. Magdalena, this $609,000 represents the total amount that you would need to run this election, correct?
To the end of the fiscal year, yes, sir.
Okay, so then to the end of
This fiscal year.
this fiscal year.
Yeah,
So
to September.
you're anticipating, or what are you using for the election, for the general election? Is that be 2023 funds?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you won't have any prior obligations for,
The only time, no, we won't.
all right. Yeah, I just want to make sure so that in case that, if this does not represent the
Okay.
total amount that is needed, and that you would
Yeah.
be looking at a prior obligation at the end of this.
Senator, for this fiscal year 2022, I believe we had a prior year obligation, but it wasn't because of the lack of the funds. It was because we received the invoices late.
I see. So are you submitting now the invoices on time, or?
Already, that
Already?
was taken care of already. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's the only question I have, Mr. Chair, just to ensure that they have enough funding for the election. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Tello-Tadegui, do you have any questions for the panel, ma'am?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to my colleagues as well as the panel that's here today. Thank you so much, Maria, and the Guam Election Commission. Tom, good to see you as always for all the work that you've done, especially in the last election that we had. You did a very, very good job on how smooth it went. So my kudos to the Guam Election Commission. I did have a question with regards to, since you moved from the Guam GCIC building, what was the rent on that building, on the Guam GCIC building?
About $12,000 a month.
A month?
Yes,
A month.
yes.
And how much are you spending right now for the current location, the new location that you're at?
10.
$10,000 a month. So there is a difference. Are you getting the same? Are you getting the same amount of square footage?
Yes, so we moved because it would save us $27,000 a year.
You save $27,000 a year.
Yeah.
Great. Excellent. And the parking is so much better, by the way, 10 times better, so appreciate it. Yeah. And the square footage you said is the same, correct? Okay. You know, it was brought up during the public hearing. I asked the question about using, well, let's go back. Let's start again. You mentioned when you had the bid out for procurement that you couldn't really speak on it because it wasn't approved yet. Has that been approved now? Okay.
Yes,
so
Senator.
Did they provide you a diagram on the setup of how I guess the routing of the cars will go, the location, the name of the route? I know, have they provided that diagram of the setup?
They provide a diagram of the existing location, where the parking is, the mezzanine level they're offering us. But as far as specific to the early voting, that happens now. So we meet, that happens now, then we put together the contract and we sign off on the contract after we get more detail.
So when they provided you the proposal for your bid, they didn't provide you a diagram, a setup of how it's going to be, how the cars are going to be routed, how people are going to be received, and where the location of the exact voting booths will be?
The room, yes. The parking slots, yes. But so because we cannot, in the procurement process, the questions they ask is what we can answer. And in that regard, you know, most people won't know as much, won't have as much information as the Election Commission does, so they don't ask the questions. Again, this is the time we set up the details, and we've already been meeting with GPD, with GVB, with DPW to set it up. And of course, Weston's right there in the middle of all this.
Okay. I do understand this setup was created so that we can encourage, you know, a higher voter turnout as well as accessibility. I mean, I think that's encouraging to provide that easy access in and out for our voters, because then they would show up. Many times people don't even go to certain stores because it's too far away, the drive is too far away. But I was just wondering, why was it so important to have a 5-mile radius? You know, I mean, Guam is not far. You look at, you know, going from here to, you know, Jotnya, even though it's not that far at all. Why do you have to have a 5-mile radius?
My job and the job of the Guam Election Commission is to protect the sanctity of the voted ballot. So we will be transporting ballots, official ballots, to and from the location. And because we are transporting it and there is no vault that's acceptable at the early vote location, we'd have to be escorted to and from the early vote center because we will bring all the ballots back to the office to secure in our cage.
Maria, I'm sorry, but whether you drive 5 miles or 10 miles, you still have to be accompanied by a police officer or, you said chauffeuring or somebody for security there. I just don't see taking away the convenience of a location that's centralized versus somewhere in Tumon. I mean, I think during the meeting or during the public hearing, one of the senators said, Weston's a great place to eat, but I don't know about voting area. And I really don't think that whether it's 5 miles or 10 miles is going to make a difference. The whole purpose of this was to entice voters to come out and vote, make it easier for them to come out and vote. So whether it costs an extra gallon of gas to go, to and from, I don't think it's going to make such a big difference. But this, of course, is our first round. We learn. Hopefully, we won't make that many mistakes, and hopefully that we're not spending money that we could have saved during this whole entire time. Learn from those mistakes, and like I said, hope it doesn't cost as we learn those mistakes. I just want to go over one more time because everyone's talking about we're appropriating these funds, $602,690 for this fiscal year, which is FY22. It was said earlier that 276, and in your testimony, 276 per election. Now, you've always told me per election, each election, like it's a primary, that's one election, and a general is another election. So in your testimony, you said 276 per election, but then you just said earlier that you'll be waiting for an appropriation for FY23 for that funding needed, and that lies in the general election. So can you kind of explain this, please?
Senator, the 276,000, that amount was specifically for early voting, not for the whole primary election.
Primary?
No, early
Oh,
voting.
sure. Okay. My time is up, and I'll probably bring that up on my second round. So thank you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tyree. Senator Blas, do you have any questions for the panel, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you also for the panel for being here. Ms. Pangilinan, in your appropriations for fiscal year 2022, how much of that was earmarked for conducting, in this case, the primary election, because it's within that fiscal year? Did you get any money from that?
So, Senator, we requested for 2.1 to include the primary election.
Okay.
Okay, so how much of it was for strictly the primary election? I go down to the categories that we have in our contract, in that form, in the BBMR form. We have stuff like ballots, consult, the vendor, we have our vendor. So how much of it is for the primary election of the 1.9? I think our personnel costs, and we have to protect the institutional knowledge. Our personnel cost comes now to about I believe 900,000. So the rest is all on, and then the other biggest year-round cost is our rent. So you already know that it's 10,000, about 10 to 12,000 a year. So everything else is for the primary. As before the primary, so we started the fiscal year in October. So before June 30th, we were closing out the 2020 election and preparing our election comparative analysis report and preparing the voter registry. So if you ask me how much is it for the primary election, that was budgeted for the fiscal year 2020, maybe about 375.
Okay.
Okay? But remember, Senator, that was not all given to us.
Sure, and I appreciate it. It's just that I think that it's no big secret that, you know, on even years, we're going to have some type of an election, okay? And that the budget should include within that cycle provisions, obviously, to conduct an election. Now, recognizing that there are increased costs, and because of now the early voting, okay, there's an increased cost. That's there or there. It's okay. This is where we're at right now. I recall in the last election, at least in the general election, early voting was extended into various sites within the island. But here we're talking about just one site, right?
Not yet, sir.
Not yet.
June 2nd is our meeting with the commissioners.
Okay.
So we will put together a timeline for early voting, and we are taking a look at going to the villages as well on a Saturday.
So that timeline and that discussion is to include, so is there a possibility that there's going to be other sites other than Weston?
On Saturdays. So we cannot open two sites at the same time. We will open a site when we're closed at Weston, yes.
Okay, so because I guess been listening to the layman, listening to the conversation, it sounds as if all early voting matters were going to take place at one spot, Weston.
It may not, sir.
Okay.
But I have to get permission from the commission.
Understood.
Thank you.
Okay,
So
but
we-
because just to recognize and understand,
you.
you know, where the, you know, and why the costs, okay? I'm going to use, thank you very much, yeah. Lester and Mr. Byrne, you're quiet over there. Someone asked you to talk now for a little bit. Where's this money going to come from?
Senator,
Yes?
on line 4 of the bill as amended,
Yes?
it says excess revenues collected above the adopted level for FY22.
Okay, I understand that. That's what the language says. The question is there $600 and some thousand?
There easily is $609,000.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Blas.
Steve's next after that.
My colleagues, we have completed the first round. We will now move to the second round. Senator Moylan, do you have any questions for the panel?
No questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel, for your
All right.
great
You
explanation.
don't have a follow-up for Senator?
No, it was answered already.
It was answered? All right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Torres, do you have any questions on the second round?
No further questions. I think everything that I had in mind was already brought up by others, but, you know, Zeus Masi also for taking the time to be here today to the panel.
Thank you, Senator Torres. Madam Speaker, do you have any questions, second round?
Yes, thank you. So to follow up on the funding source, when we went through the FY21 excess revenues, there were some bills, we had committee of the whole, and we talked about where they would be spent. The FY21 excess revenues were predicted to be 62 million, and 20 million of that for tax refunds, 20.7 million for special fund deficit, 1.5 million for the FY20 audit, 10 million for war claims, 5 million for GFD overspending, and then 3.5 for the Humatak School, the FQ Sanchez, and $250,000 for Guma. That left 1.05 million in FY21 excess revenues. Does that sound correct to you, Mr. Byrne?
Just from memory, Speaker, yes.
And so for FY22 excess revenues, we talked just in our recent liquid fuels tax public hearing that, well, okay, my figures need to be updated because now instead of 68 million projected excess, we have about 82, 84, $87 million projected excess FY22 general fund unappropriated revenues. 25 million of that was allocated for the LEAP, 6.6 million current shortfall of the FY22 special funds. Are the governor was quoted in an article in the Post saying that the raises in FY22 for law enforcement pay would be paid with current agency budgets. Is that still the case?
We're using the agency's funding as provided by the FY22 budget, and we have ARP money that is, when you look at the report that we submit every month, you see that it's allocated to all the different public safety agencies, but none of it's encumbered. That is the source of funds to be able to take care of any shortfall in the public safety realm for raises.
Okay, so then that looks like then we still have about 56.1 million available in FY22 excess revenues. So 56.1 million, all right. And does that sound correct to you, Mr.
I believe that's probably accurate, Speaker, because as you mentioned earlier on, the only statutorily authorized expenditure was the LEAP.
Okay, LEAP, all right, that's correct. That's what I see. Okay, what about, so what about the reserves from FY21? Were those released to the agencies and they were able to spend those, or what happened to, or were there any?
Yeah, we actually sent you a governor's transfer letter, and it detailed what agencies lapsed and what agencies had shortfalls that we had to make up. If you will note, we did not zero out any particular agency for 21, and we allowed for them to have some of the funding that they were not able to utilize in 21 still available to them in 22. Okay. So I think we transmitted that the first week of April.
All right. And in FY22, are you currently still setting aside reserves from the agency's allocations?
Yes, ma'am.
Why are we doing that if we are predicting already an $87 million excess?
It's the only budgetary tool I have. What we do is we allocate, and we send that also to you by the 15th of October, the Appropriation Allocation report. So every month we allocate funding, we project like personnel needs, and every once in a while Mr. Byrne will send me a note telling me that an agency overexpended, and so we need to do a budget adjustment, just so that we can keep tabs on expenditures. It also provides for, this is a really good example, if you remember the leak we had at the Agana pool, and that leak cost us $1 million. If there wasn't the ability to hold in reserve funds to cover expenses like that, and as detailed in the governor's transfer letter that we provided to you, then we would be in a situation where people may overexpend, overtime might be incurred that in the beginning of the fiscal year that cannot be covered even though it's necessary to close the books. So it's just, it's the only tool that BBMR has to monitor spending, to make adjustments, and then more importantly, to make sure that whatever this body passes is sufficient for the operations in any fiscal year.
And what about the, so the DOE teacher salary increases? Did they get clarification yet from the federal government as to whether that could be covered with the federal funds?
I haven't heard anything yet.
That's 10 million. Okay. All right, so back to the bill and the language. Let me just make sure I get the substitute amended version. So is this language necessary to put in here? Excess revenues collected above the adopted levels of fiscal year 2022?
For the clarity purposes that we talked about earlier, so that, like the fiscal note said, we're not taking 609,000 from an appropriation that the body made for 22.
All right.
I think it is important.
Okay, because it's $609,000, that's less than the million that we are estimating to be remaining in FY21. We could also change that to fiscal year 2021.
If I may take that one up, Speaker, I think the problem with that is the calculation you just went through, and I agreed to, was a rough calculation. I think it might be dangerous, is putting it strongly, but we might end up with slightly different numbers. You know, we're finalizing the financial statements now. We might end up with slightly different numbers, especially in the areas of the subsidy required by the special funds.
Yeah, I think this week it's going to be June, and we're still finalizing the financial statements. Weren't we trying to get those out earlier this year so that we could have that in advance of our budget proceedings?
Yes, and you will. But as the public auditor said, and I thoroughly support that, you know, we're dealing with $1.8 billion of federal funds, and that certainly has required a lot more work this year. There are 18 major federal programs that we're having to audit. So that has certainly held up or prolonged.
Okay, so it's June, and we're expecting to go into budget deliberations July. When do you expect us to see where whether the 1 million exists or doesn't exist, or where it was spent?
Statutorily, we have to report by June 30th. For the purposes of the bonds, we have to report by June 27th, and we will make those dates.
That's not earlier than before, is it?
No, for the reasons the reasons I just gave you, the whole process has taken very much longer. And I think you can even see in the reports that have come to date, all the component units, and we only just got the DOE report last week. All the component units have also taken longer to complete their reports.
All right, well, I thank you, Mr. Byrne. And just, Mr. Chair, I guess if your team is able to do those numbers for us, I'd like to know whether the 1 million is, you know, whether we can use that instead, so we can use FY22 for other purposes that are not known yet or not decided yet. But otherwise, the 1 million may end up in that, like where the other excess revenues went for FY20, and we're not sure to this date exactly where those were spent, except, you know, in the category of deficit, but we don't get a you know, clear review of those things. That's my suggestion, Mr. Chair, but otherwise, thank you to the panel.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Senator Perez, do you have any questions for the panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions, but I do want to thank the panel for taking their time today.
Thank you, Senator Perez. Senator Brown, do you have any questions?
I did want to ask, because this came up recently with the desire to have a closed primary. And I wanted to, if you could elaborate what the steps were, Ms. Pangilinan, in doing that. I mean, that for the rest of us is new. I don't know if it's going to happen, and then maybe policy decisions need to be made whether or not we should fund it, or I know there's been debates in the past whether primary elections should be funded at all by the government and whether or not it should be done by the individual parties. But out of curiosity, what would be the process involved to actually have a closed primary that was proposed by the other party?
Okay.
And why was it not able to be done? I know the time frame and infrastructure, maybe you could elaborate on that.
So what was out there was the result of a court ruling that said the Guam Election Commission must send out a letter to the parties. We send a letter to the party chairman of the Democrat and Republican parties to ask them how would they like to hold the primaries. This has been done since 2004. Every election cycle, the Guam Election Commission sends out this letter. This is the first time that it has been brought up, that a closed primary election has been brought up. So with regard to that, the deadline based on past practice and possibly the court ruling was that they have until June 28th to decide if they want a closed primary. That ruling was in 2004. Subsequent laws have been passed that create a monstrosity of a timeline for everything else. If the deadline to tell us whether we're going to have a closed primary is June 28th, the ballots have to be prepared and sent out July 13th. And that was a requirement put on the GEC in 2010. So we have those other time constraints that were passed subsequent to 2004. So we hope that come June 30th, 2023, we will have recommendations for the legislature to look at to correct these innuendos in the law, in the election code of Guam.
And I guess if we were to look at the parties funding their own primaries, and that would no longer be the burden of the election commission, we wouldn't be spending $600,000+ a year, but I'm sure it'll create interesting dynamics for the parties and who's running the party, of who ends up getting moved forward, and hence the controversy. So other than that, it's just these additional requirements you said that the legislature or the laws have since put in place since the ruling that make it a little more complicated to actually schedule a closed primary.
The time constraint is crazy.
And if the election commission were still to be the one in charge of it, how would you determine that? Are you determining by who's actually registered? When they register to vote, did they register a specific party? Is that how you would determine who would be eligible to vote? Would that be on the burden of the shoulders of the election commission?
Possibly, but there's other stuff. Another thing we have to look at are the respective parties' constitutions or bylaws to see what they do. As far as I can see, when I was asked this question, which voter registry we have to use, whether it's the parties that say they have so many party members, as far as the law is concerned, we have to use the GEC voter registry.
Okay, so we would have to be specifically, and I registered so many years ago, but we would have to make sure that if we were to do that, we had a party declared rather than just registering to vote as a resident.
Yeah. And Senator, there will be administrative rules and regulations for closed primary that the Election Commission will work on for the upcoming years.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you for the information.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Senator Adder, do you have any other questions?
No, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to thank the panel for being here. Thank you. Thank you
All right,
again,
thank
everyone.
you. Senator Tadaway, do you have any questions, ma'am?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was able to do the math, Maria, on that last question that I had to bail out because my time was up, but I understand now where the funding you're requesting for. However, when you requested for your budget appropriation for the Guam Election Commission in FY20 for 2022. Was it 1.9 million that you requested for, or is it 1.6? Because technically you only received 1.6.
Yeah, we requested more than we received. So it was 1.9.
You requested, your request was for 1.9,
Yes.
but you received 1.6. Okay. You know, earlier it was discussed with, from one of my colleagues about the excess revenue. And Mr. Byrne, during the public hearing, I had asked a list of what funds have been expended for the excess revenue. And I made it, you know, I tried to make it as clear as I can, and since I've been back in the 35th and the 36th during the budget hearings, to incorporate the inability for the governor to spend excess revenue without the legislative approval. It must be this legislature to approve any excess revenue. So when I asked for the list of what was expended for the excess revenue for FY21, it didn't have it on you, so I went ahead and brought it with me. Speaker was very good at mentioning all of it. I'm not going to go through the whole amount, but there was one that was left out for the veterans, and that was Bill 227 for $500,000. And after you subtract from 62 million all the way down to the last item I have on my list, which is the same list that the speaker has, I come up with 1.25000. So about $1.2 million left in excess revenue is what I'm showing. So I know you mentioned earlier that you want to be cautious and that this money might not be there, but so can you explain when we'll know? I mean, I did talk to the Office of Public Accountability when they're going to have the audit report for FY21. So do you happen to know when that's going to come out, Mr. Byrne?
Senator, as I just responded to the speaker, we will have it done by the statutory deadlines that are set forth for us, which is basically at the end of June.
Okay, and you do concur, you said earlier, that these lists of expenditures, and since I have, let me just go ahead and do the expenditures. We have 20 million in tax refunds. Estimated shortfall in the special funds for FY21 was 20 million. The deficit at 1.5, war claims at 10 million, and the Guam Fire Department 5 million, then Bill 170, 172, and Bill 227. So that leaves us a balance of a 1.2 million, $1,250,000 remaining. So, you know, I don't know if we can make an amendment, Mr. Chair, to utilize this money in FY21, but I think that, you know, it might be a better solution because there are so much more bills that are trying to get through, or salary increases and we're not even incorporating the 35 million that's going to come out of the general fund from a bill that appropriates to the new hospital, and that's still on the books. So.
Senator, please don't forget in your calculations that the two skeletons in the cupboard of prior year obligations and continuing appropriations.
I'm sorry, say that again. Please don't forget what?
The skeletons of prior year obligations and continuing appropriations.
Prior year obligations and continuing appropriations, yes. I'm looking at those as they come in and the reports that come in. I mean, that's why you put aside, a certain percentage from everybody's appropriations or allocations, you know, to ensure that it's not overspending. For instance, I do have a question with regards to the fire department. It shows that 5 million needs to be appropriated because they overexpended $5 million. Can you tell me where that $5 million is going to come from?
If you're talking about FY21, the governor's transfer that was sent to the legislature the first week of April addressed the fire department's overspending. So that was already taken care of.
The 5 million from and where did the funding come from?
The governor's transfer authority.
Okay, within the, so there's still $5 million there then in excess revenue. So that means we have more than $1.2 million left over. It looks like we have $6.2 million left over. If we're not incorporating that $5 million to be used from excess revenue on FY21, then there's like 6 million in FY21 available, over 6 million. So, Mr. Chair, that's something that we really need to look at, because if they're saying that that 5 million has already been covered from transfer authority, it's not incorporated in that list that I provided you on WhatsApp, Mr. Chair. So again, I thank you, everyone, Maria and Tom, for all your hard work. Please extend our Dankalusi Jus Masi to the staff of the Guam Election Commission. We definitely notice the hard work that they're doing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My time is up.
Thank you. Senator Blanche, do you have any questions for the panel?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Carlson and Mr. Byrne, right now we are anticipating excess revenue of 82 million for this fiscal year. Is that correct?
87.
87, okay. Isn't it been the practice and that although we can anticipate that that would be the excess revenue by the end of the fiscal year, that we wait until the books for that fiscal year are basically done and then before we can spend that money?
I think you'll be okay, Senator, given the amount of revenue that we've collected, the trends that we're seeing, the return of tourists that are up at Adelup, the trolley that I saw for the first time in 2 years making its way through Adelup. I just feel that we did have a good April. I think that month alone accounted for like $20-some million in additional funds, but I don't see why you couldn't, as was done with LEAP, basically appropriate the money. I agree with the comments made by Senator Taitigui that this body basically sets the policy and the spending. And when we were going through the lists of further encumbrances on FY22 revenues with the Speaker, the only thing statutorily is the LEAP. So,
isn't the LEAP supposed to come from the general fund and
yes,
cost share from?
yes. So the body here authorized $25 million. The governor did 25 from ARP, but then she actually threw in probably another 12 or 13.
Well, I
So,
don't want to get into the semantics of the whole thing. However, I recognize the need for the election commission for the $600 and some thousand. My concern is, and I saw the same trolley and I've seen the same tourists, but that's the trolley that hasn't been used in 2 years, and there's a tourist that hasn't come in 2 years. So there's a lot of making up to do with regard to the trolley and the tourists. That said, when was the last time this government, without federal stimulus funding, just in its organic growth, able to realize excess revenues in excess of $80 million with a budget that has been increasing over the years? When was the last time we saw those kind of figures?
First of all, sir, when we did the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act correction and we raised the BPT from 4% to 5%, we cut $30 million in government spending, and that has been the baseline for operations until recently with adjustments for teachers' pay, nurses' pay, and public safety pay. So we did cut, and we're now basically, for retention and morale purposes, raising these the salaries for these three groups of people for all the right reasons. So we did cut spending in 2018, and we haven't increased the personnel cost across the board like that has been done recently until just I think it started with the nurses' pay. Yeah. So and you know just to be fair, sir, we were at a disagreement when we were debating the FY22 budget. We were advocating for $50 million more, but we didn't get it.
Yeah, but you just finished saying that she used $25 million in excess revenues that we didn't even appropriate.
No, you did appropriate, sir.
No, we told you out of the general fund.
Sir, it was in the bill, sir.
No, that's what I said. I'm not going to get. I don't mean to, and I don't want to get into the semantics of the whole thing here, Mr. Carlson. My concern here is, and I'm going to stick to what this bill is about. I want to ensure. We're talking about excess revenues for FY 2022, and the fiscal year hasn't been done yet, so it's really difficult to be able to claim excess when the year hasn't even been done. I just want to make sure that they get their $603,000. Okay? We can get into the other discussions as to how we're going to make that up and when we need to make that up, down the road. So, and I appreciate that. Mr. Guerrero, I did promise that I was going to make you speak. Okay? How does this have any effect on what you've been tracking, what OFB has been tracking with regard to what we anticipate for revenues in FY22 and then the impact that it could possibly have on FY2023?
No, Senator. When you talk about impact, I hope you're not talking about a negative impact, because obviously, I think we're all pleasantly surprised that the revenues being collected as of the 7 months of FY22 is really, like Mr. Carlson said, is robust. It's not affecting the FY22 revenue estimates simply because we were a little bit more conservative going into FY22. So thus, I guess being maybe at this point pretty much conservative, we're seeing this surplus of revenues coming in for FY22. So to your answer, to your question, no, it's not affecting the FY22 revenue estimates.
Okay, so along those lines too then, and recognizing and listening to the previous conversation about the anticipated excess of FY2021, is there room in the excess of FY2021 to be able to fund it? Because the money should be there already, if it's there.
If what was provided, basically, I believe it was a report, just a simple report that was issued that showed how the 62 million was going to be utilized. Mm-hmm. And as Senator Tello mentioned previously, that there's roughly maybe about a little over $1 million balance. Then if you're talking about that excess revenue, as compared to the amount in the bill, I believe that revenue would be sufficient to cover the amount in the bill.
Okay, I just want to give us the options to be able to consider. At the end of the day, it's being able to find the $603,000. It's amazing how, in this day and age, I I remember when Mr. Carlson and I were on the same side of the aisle here, that we'd have to squeeze 2 pennies to get a nickel on certain things, and now it's easy for us to have a $603,000 conversation like this. So I'm just looking at all the different options on that. Okay? Thank you very much. I did promise I was going to make you speak, so I fulfill my promise.
Thank you, Senator Blas. My colleagues, we have completed the 2 rounds of questions. We'll now proceed to the 3rd, but before that, I'd like to excuse the panel that have joined us today. Mr. Byrne, Mr. Carlson, Mr. Guerrero, Ms. Pangilinan, Mr. San Augustine. Thank you. We will stand on recess, and then we will return back to go to amendment, but because of the time, we will recess until 2:30. All right? Please get your amendments in. Thank you.